Good evening. Good evening, everyone. I'm Harold Holzer, the director of Roosevelt House, and on behalf of Jennifer Rabb, president of Hunter College, and our esteemed Board of Advisor member and inspiration, Bill Vanden Heuvel, who is here with us this evening, I want to welcome you. I apologize for starting a little late. It's entirely my fault, and I'm going to speak uncharacteristically slowly because Jonathan Alter, our interlocutor, is on his way from MSNBC, where he was obligated to, that's his story anyway, obligated to go on camera. But he will join us, and we will wait no longer, and our special guest will speak to us as Jonathan makes his way here. Well, it's a pleasure to welcome you to another very special and very timely public program on history. As some of you may know, we're only 2 weeks from the 75th anniversary of the day that the Roosevelt family turned over the key to this building in its original incarnation to Hunter College, so it could begin a new life as a center for interfaith and biracial clubs and events, with FDR declaring us the first college center named for the high purpose of mutual understanding, dedicated to goodwill among students. It's a call that we've tried to live up to for 3/4 of a century. As most of you know, our regulars for 10 years as a public policy center, its latest incarnation with a completely revamped interior. We will have much more to say about our history, our mission, and our goals for the future when we mark this Diamond Jubilee with a dinner and program on November 27th with special guests Doris Kearns Goodwin and Judy Collins, and maybe some surprises that we're working on. So the invitation, this is a commercial, the invitations to that benefit are on your seats. Feel free to sign up and sign on. Ambassador Vanden Heuvel is one of our chairs for the evening, so he is actually going to take reservations as soon as we finish this program. It should be an unforgettable evening, and so should this evening. Anyone who has read the coverage and reviews of David Levering Lewis's magisterial new biography of Wendell Willkie, or knows the work of this extraordinary scholar, knows that we are very fortunate indeed to have a great historian with us tonight to talk about the man who ran against Franklin Roosevelt in his quest for a third term in 1940. The New York Times called the improbable Wendell Willkie insightful and compelling, and the New Yorker praised the book for successfully, as it says, bringing the now largely unknown Willkie to a new generation. In introducing it, the Atlantic magazine closed with this most revealing quote from Willkie himself: "If I could write my own epitaph, and if I had to choose between saying, 'Here lies an unimportant president,' or 'Here lies one who contributed to saving freedom at a moment of great peril,' I would prefer the latter." By the way, the person who wrote that article and cited that quote is the grandson and namesake of the 1940 Republican candidate, Wendell Willkie. I had hoped that he might join us tonight, but he could not be with us because he's teaching a class as we speak. But, and it's not, however, it's equally exciting for me to welcome another grandson of the subject of Professor Lewis's book, Wendell's brother, David Willkie, who is here, and also Wendell Willkie's only living nephew, Mr. Hall Willkie. Roosevelt House welcomes you both. Could you both stand up so our audience can see you? Thank you for coming. Well, as our frequent guests know, the Roosevelts were long gone from this house by 1940, but as I always feel I should acknowledge, this is the house where FDR recovered from polio in the 1920s, from which Eleanor got her start as an advocate for civil rights and human rights, and where in 1924, as we were just talking to Professor Lewis about, FDR relentlessly practiced steel braces on his legs, hauling himself back and forth along the floor of the second floor library, trying to simulate walking the exact distance he would have to walk to make his comeback appearance at the 1924 Democratic National Convention. Oh, good. I can start talking in my usual pace now, because John is here. That same room would later serve, John, sit here, as the command center for Roosevelt's two campaigns for governor and for his 1932 run for the presidency. And in that same room, in the months between the 32 election and his inauguration 4 months later, this is perfect timing, as our special guest interlocutor, Jonathan Alter, demonstrated in the early chapters of his own book about FDR's first 100 days. This is where Roosevelt would begin weaving together the threads that would constitute the social safety net, the basic elements of the New Deal, including Social Security, minimum wage, child labor laws, and an idea that seems so elusive today, infrastructure. Wendell Willkie's kind of politics seems missing in action today as well, the idea of being above party and partisanship and caring more about the country than about one's own temporary triumphs, and whose own book, One World, acknowledged the common aspirations for peace and freedom that FDR later hoped would inspirit the entire country, indeed the world. So David Levering Lewis is here to explore the character he has animated so brilliantly. He is the only writer ever to win 2 Pulitzer Prizes for the same book. I love this statistic. How did he do it? For Volume 1 and Volume 2 of his magnificent biography of W.E.B. Du Bois, for which he also won the Bancroft Prize and the Francis Parkman Prize. That's known in our trade as the trifecta. His other books include King, a critical biography, When Harlem Was in Vogue, and Prisoners of Honor, The Dreyfus Affair. His full biography is in your program tonight. He retired from the NYU History Department in 2013 as Julius Silver University professor. Earlier, he had been Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of History at Rutgers, and he's held teaching positions at other institutions throughout the country. And we're very proud to welcome him. As I mentioned, he'll be in discussion with the journalist, biographer, and most recently television producer, Jonathan Alter, who was the author of The Defining Moment, FDR's 100 Days and the Triumph of Hope, and 2 terrific books about the Obama years, The Promise and The Center Holes. And I'm obliged to tell you, as specified in our contract, that he is at work on a biography of Jimmy Carter, which is you have to do here when it comes out. So I implore you all just to turn off any devices that make noise. Let me remind you, our format tonight will be a discussion when Jonathan and Professor Lewis are ready. We'll take questions from you, during which I ask you to please wait for the microphone, not because we doubt that you can all project magnificently, but because we're recording tonight's event for YouTube and our Roosevelt House website. And following all of that, we invite you upstairs for a reception in the Four Freedoms Room, during which our special guest will be signing his book. So now, without any further ado, please welcome Jonathan Alter and David Levering Lewis.
Thank you so much, Harold. I'm really honored to be here with Professor Lewis, who I've revered for many years, even though I'm not sure we've ever met, maybe once or twice. Yeah, once or twice. And I just want to say before we start that I think the audience size is a testament not just to Professor Lewis, but also, and to Roosevelt House, but to a sense that we have that this book is exquisitely well-timed. for a lot of different reasons that I hope we can get into. But so let's kind of start there. What intrigued you and convinced you to write this book in the first place?
Quite by peradventure, I was fishing in a drawer at the Library of Congress looking for something relevant to a book I was then writing about the Harlem Renaissance. And I came across a copy of a letter from Wendell Willkie to Walter White, who was the long-serving CEO, president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And it was written in his hand, and it said that he had never enjoyed so much the evening that the Whites had hosted, that people might think he was depressed because he had been ostracized by his own party, because his presidential ambitions were gone. But no, this was an evening poignant. These men appreciated what I have tried to do, and I leave you redoubled in my determination of useful citizenship. And, said he, Walter, I'm going to finish the book we are writing together about race in America. And I thought, well, what a curious relationship this must have been. And I put the memory away until much later. Later, I was asked by Walter Isaacson to contribute to a collection of essays about leadership in America. And I'm sure Walter thought that I would continue with W.E.B. Du Bois. But I had spent 15 years getting these 2 Pulitzers, and I thought maybe I could and would like to do something else. And so very briefly, I did a profile of Wendell Willkie. And that profile has been with me ever since. The life of the man, the relationship with Walter White, his commitments, his failures, his ambitions, all of that, it seemed to me would make quite a timely and useful document. It turns out that for a variety of reasons, which those who read the acknowledgments will see, the book was delayed. There was some grief, the loss of a spouse, the loss of an agent, and so on. And so I feared when finally I got around to writing the book that it would be just a curiosity, like the other people in Irving Stone's also ran. They should have run, but probably their not winning was not of great significance. But I didn't feel that as I wrote this book. And especially because by the delay, its timing is indeed, it seems to me, quite welcome. I did not anticipate that an anti-Willkie would occupy the Oval Office. There had been other businessmen who quested for the Golden Ring. You could think of Steve Forbes, or you could think of any number of businessmen. And these days, names elude me very quickly. But when it happened in 2016, as I was well through this book, I thought it may serve because it will remind us that decency and principles and a goal for egalitarianism and at the same time prosperity would be very well relevant. And so it seems that that is the case.
So let's just talk a little bit about his background. And I was fascinated that Goebbels and the Nazis made a thing about his German heritage, which it turns out to have a connection to the German liberal revolution of 1848 and all kinds of things that they didn't mention. But first, tell us a little bit why his German heritage became an issue during the war, and also what that German progressive heritage was about in this country?
Yes, that was almost an implausible moment when the Minister of Propaganda, Goebbels, assembled the neutral press right after Wendell Willkie's defeat in 1940. And there, the press corps was handed a document which proved, said Goebbels, that the Willkies had not participated in the 1848 revolution. They were not stalwarts of democracy and republicanism and anti-monarchy. No, they were forced to leave because the widow of the founder of the family had been deceived by a Jew and had sold the smithy to a Jew, impoverishing the family. And therefore, that was why the Willkies finally in 1860 arrived in the United States. The Times reported that as though it were credible. But fortunately, an Austrian economist, Ludwig von Mies, who had just arrived on these shores, pointed out that 1848 was a time when, irrespective of your class, because the Willkies were not men of women, people of great prosperity, the darkness of monarchy and the Bismarckian autocracy that was coming was clear to everyone. And so the Willkies indeed had a very good reason to leave, and they did. And the tradition of the 1848ers, the people who had participated in what was called the spring of that period, those people brought with them a deeply believed commitment to republicanism, so much so that Wendell Willkie grew up with a father who was a proponent of the man whose program was his message. William Jennings Bryan,
right.
who had captured the Democratic Party with his Cross of Gold speech, and who was a frequent visitor to Elwood. And one of the memories of young Wendell, is being outside around the corner listening to their father lecture William Jennings Bryan on the staleness of the issue of bimetallism and gold, and reproaching him for a kind of equivocation over empire, as this was the time, of course, when, as Kipling had said, it was the time when Americans should pick up the white man's burden, and so we were in the Philippines and in Cuba. The father said, "Oh no, this is not the kind of America we want. It isn't the kind of America we came to serve." And so that tradition of the 1848 Germans was profoundly part of Willkie's political DNA. But mistakenly, Goering had thought that, Dr. Goebbels rather, had thought that the Germans would vote against entry into the war, and that Willkie would represent a German non-interventionism that would benefit the Third Reich. And when that did not happen, and Willkie, having lost to FDR, then praised the British for standing up as a lone node in what was a darkening Europe, Goebbels was furious, and he assembled the press for that moment.
I'm fascinated by I don't want to dwell on this, but we'll get to Roosevelt in a second, but the sort of cosmic circularity of this. You know, you have the 1848 German Revolution, then you have these very progressive German immigrants, and I didn't know that they were anti-colonial at the turn of the century, anti-imperialistic. Then, so Wilkie becomes an anti-imperialist, a one-worlder, and the United Nations kind of comes out of that. And then post-war Germany, as represented by Angela Merkel, she's like living in this Wendell Willkie world. And, you know, it all just comes right all the way around. But just in terms of, I think one thing that a lot of believers in the New Deal are wondering about Willkie is, you know, how did he get into business, and how could he have been a utility executive critical of the New Deal without being an enemy of the New Deal? How did he walk that line, and where was his criticism of the New Deal justified, and where was it maybe unjustified?
Well, I think it was handy that you brought up the business about 1848 and Goebbels, because Wendell remained a convinced and committed Democrat throughout his professional life until quite late in it. And in 1930, he became, because of his proficiency as a utilities lawyer, as a first-rate advocate of any cause at all, and as a man who had, in two Democratic conventions, played a rather conspicuous part. Part of that 1848 tradition,
1920 and 24.
Yes, right? Part of that 1848 tradition linked to the legacy of course, Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations. And Daddy Willkie believed that this had been a great shortfall on the part of his country, that the vision of Woodrow Wilson
yeah.
had been rejected. So Wendell grew up with that lost opportunity, and in 1924 he was one of the floor managers of Newton Baker, who was, for all intents and purposes, the legatee of Woodrow Wilson.
So I want to add a footnote here. For those of you who don't know who Newton Baker is, he was, in 1932, he was the smart money choice to be the Democratic nominee for president. And like, if you had been en route to Chicago to, you know, take part in this convention that ended up nominating Roosevelt on the fourth ballot, many of you, well, maybe not being from New York, but a lot of people were, you know, the columnists kind of underestimated Roosevelt, and they all thought that this guy Newton Baker was going to be president.
Yes, well, with good reason. Baker was an imposing man, and as I say, was the heir to that great missed opportunity, both in 1924 and then again in 1920 and in 1924, and then again in 1928. And so he was present at the Democratic Convention in 1932, again serving the cause of Woodrow Wilson and Woodrow Wilson's heir, Newton Baker. And as you point out, it was a close-run thing. Franklin was not going to get the necessary, goodness knows how many votes, and so in the 11th hour, FDR told Baker that he would have his support if in the next ballot things were still in stasis. But they weren't, because the First Lord of California, Hearst, hated Newton Baker more than he hated Roosevelt, and McAdoo, the son-in-law of Woodrow Wilson, hated Al Smith, who was also in the picture, and so FDR did emerge. as the president and New Deal man. Willkie had a kind of aversion to FDR because he thought that FDR had so politicized his position on the League of Nations and internationalism that he was in fact a fancy pants who was quite prepared politically and adroitly to triangulate various positions. And so, still a Democrat, he did, in the conclusion, vote for FDR, and then he went off to his business. And his business was to be the preternaturally young president of the third largest utility concern in the United States, Commonwealth and Southern. The story of the assembly of Commonwealth and Southern is fascinating in many ways, but the point was that there we had Willkie running Commonwealth and Southern, just as, of course, the Depression smote the land. There was a complication, though, about being a utilities man, and that is that there was another utilities man who headed a similarly named utility corporation called Commonwealth Edison. And his name was Samuel Insull, and Insull was a master of holding company manipulation and mystagogy. And the consequences were that in 1929 and 1930, his holding company unraveled, and Chicago and its citizens were the victims of a horrendous collapse, sort of like a collapse of, I won't remember what it was, so I won't go there. But Roosevelt campaigned on the malevolence of Samuel Insull. Again and again, he would say, Insull, we must reclaim the temple and get rid of the Insulls. The Insulls are responsible for our misery. Well, Wendell had met Insull and had lectured with him in the detritus of the collapse and said, look, if we're honest, we don't need to play defense. We will do our job. And Insull famously said, you have, young man, lots to learn. Well, when on the campaign trail, Insull became such a factor, when Roosevelt entered the White House, as one of his first acts of the 100 days was to create his own utilities corporation, as it were, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Again, quite okay. However, Commonwealth and Southern lit up to a degree the Mississippi Delta. Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, South Carolina, they all were fueled and lit up by Commonwealth and Southern. And the creation of Tennessee Valley Authority was a bit of a surprise to Wendell Willkie. The surprise soon became consternation, soon became a great battle royal throughout the next 8 years, Supreme Court rulings, all of them ultimately in favor of the Tennessee Valley Authority, but one never knew that was going to happen. And so as Willkie leading the utilities cadre through the federal judiciary, Roosevelt was never sure that this Neolithic Supreme Court, which was about to strike down the AAA agricultural adjustment, and about to strike down the National Industrial Recovery Act, and indeed probably about to strike down Social Security, that court would surely be sympathetic to Willkie by the time he got there. And so this became indeed the greatest challenge to the New Deal, Wendell Willkie's Commonwealth and Southern. And out of that came not a disappointed or a disillusioned Democrat, but a very angry Democrat who continued to be a Democrat throughout the 30s until finally, with the resolution of the combat between Commonwealth and Southern and TVA, Willkie had become such a figure of criticism of the New Deal, smartly so that the Republican Party, searching on life support as it had been since 1936 for a candidate, began to pay attention to the arguments of Wendell Willkie against the imperial presidency and against the alphabet soup of hyper-regulation of life, against the philosophy, indeed, of the New Deal, which was not of production, but of distribution of wealth, not the production of it. And these issues Wendell found a voice for that were really quite compelling, in certainly among chambers of commerce, country clubs, indeed, but also given a kind of increased volume by the Time, Life, Fortune consortium of Henry Luce. But to get to the point, in 1939, Willkie received a buyout, a compensation, and Commonwealth and Southern became part of TVA. And indeed, it became part of TVA in the same way that in 1932, it could have become part of TVA. The bargain was simply the federalizing of Commonwealth and Southern. The same employees remained now on the federal budget. And so the argument really was quite unnecessary. It had been an argument that had become ideological for really no good reason, you might say. And Willkie believed that, as in his various interactions with FDR, who sometimes said, yes, I think we can have a deal, and sometimes would say no, he believed that but for Felix Frankfurter's happy hot dogs, as he called them, these brilliant young men coming out of Harvard to service the New Deal, the Thomas Corcoran, and the Mr. And others manning the bureaucracy, and David Lilienthal, who became an active player as one of the third directors of TVA, that those men had, whenever Roosevelt saw a pragmatic solution, had come along to say, no, you've got to remember that at Wall Street and its utilities spawn were responsible for the Depression. They are our enemies, and there can be no compromise. It's curious, however, that the man who built TVA, Arthur Ernest Morgan, a civil engineer of remarkable achievement, that he, from the beginning, believed that the solution to the problem of TVA and Commonwealth and Southern was a compromise. Commonwealth was there should be a buyout, and he, Morgan, could build his dams named after various progressive Republicans, indeed, curiously enough, Wheeler and George Norris of Nebraska, that the solution would have been a compromise. It was not, and so finally Wendell fought the battle with the assistance of Arthur Morgan, who was soon fired tearfully by Roosevelt, and with the 1940 election approaching and the 1938 reclamation of both the Senate and the House to a degree by the Republicans, who suddenly had 7 new senators and a quite plethora of House seats.
This is after court packing, right? This is in the 38 midterms?
This is right after the
Right,
court
right.
packing.
They still didn't get control.
Court packing is
The Demo-
37, of
Yeah, the
course.
Democrats had control, but they just lost some in those midterms, as often happens. I just want to, but before we move on to this unbelievably fascinating 1940 campaign, I just wanted just one more word on the economics of this, because again, you know, on a lot of social issues, racial issues, and so forth, you could make the argument that Willkie was every bit as liberal, or maybe more liberal, since the Democratic Party was then, you know, partly the party of Southern racists. But on economics, you say that he was not an Adam Smith guy; he was a Keynesian, which was a real revelation to me. That even on economic issues, he wasn't that far away from the New Deal.
He was not, because in fact he was a progressive Democrat wearing the hat of a utilities mogul.
Just like a Tom Steyer, you know.
All
somebody-
right, yes, indeed. Here we have a billionaire who wants to do right by the Republic, and of course impeach the malefactors. Yes, I think that's true, and that became appealing to a larger group than simply Wall Street, obviously. And so the Main Street listened and hearkened to Willkie's argument. And his argument was, in 1939, when he begins to talk about the insufficiencies of the New Deal. After all, in 1937-38, Roosevelt had made a great boner. He had collapsed the New Deal. The depression of the Second Depression, the Roosevelt Depression, produced another 15 million unemployed in a light switch velocity. He had abandoned the pump priming that worked, even though John Maynard Keynes had visited him shortly after the 1936 and tried to explain something about Keynesian economics, and went away saying, well, the president is not an economist, that's quite clear. And so he wasn't, and so returning to balanced budgets, he collapsed the New Deal, and then he had to reverse himself, and he learned something about Keynes, and by 1939, it was beginning to reverse, but at the same time, Republicans had found an argument in terms of the packing of the Supreme Court, a great offense, believe it or not, then, to the general public, and a whole concatenation of things that bedeviled Roosevelt in that 38-39 period, especially the loss of the support of labor and John L. Lewis because of these sit-in strikes and what have you, that Roosevelt tried to play both sides of the street, labor and management over. And so we have the possibility of a Wendell Willkie's presidency. I spent some time going in the chapter called the Political Science 101 and Serendipity, because the unlikeliness of a Wendell Willkie leading the Republican Party as a Democrat, feisty though he was still a Democrat vis-a-vis Roosevelt, was, of course, that the Eastern establishment, seeing what was happening in Europe, feared that you would have a compounded disgrace if the natural instincts of the then Republican Party of isolationism prevailed at a time when, of course, we would soon have a Second World War, and the interests of the democracies would be in great peril.
Were all of his rivals, he was at 3% in the polls a month or 6 weeks before he was nominated in Philadelphia. Were all of his rivals isolationists?
All were isolationists except Dewey from time to time.
Dewey was a kid. He was like a boy.
Well,
governor
as
of New
someone
York.
said, it was Ickes who was famous for these these put downs. He said, Dewey's going to throw his diaper in the ring, isn't he?
Right. And Ickes also called, tell people what he called Wendell Willkie.
Well, Wendell Willkie is a barefoot lawyer from Wall Street. That was another Ickesism.
But it's just this part, to me, of the entire story, this part is the most consequential in sort of world historical terms. And I'm interested in whether you agree with me, because if they had nominated Taft, Vandenberg, who was still an isolationist, he wasn't.
Or Hoover.
Or Hoover, believe it or not, Herbert Hoover was in the mix.
They're still very much
Or
in the
like
mix.
you read the Philip Roth novel, it turns out that Lindbergh wasn't interested, but if he had been, he would have been nominated. If they'd gone in that isolationist direction, and you mentioned at some point that Roosevelt himself really understood this, what would the consequences have been for Lend-Lease and a draft in 1940 that prepared us for World War II? Here's I guess, the nub of my question. Nub of my question is, if Wendell Willkie had not been nominated, would we have not been prepared for World War II? Because the draft went through by one vote, and if the Republican nominee had been an isolationist, there's no way it would have been approved, and we would have faced Pearl Harbor with no army.
I think the answer to your question is obvious, isn't it? Willkie is responsible for four things. The history of it is, of course, endlessly fascinating in terms of how he gets the votes or how he doesn't get the votes. But he begins first campaigning and agreeing with Roosevelt that the first step in bringing the United States into the morass or the fray was the 50 destroyers deal with the British, 50 moth-eaten World War II destroyers given to the Brits in exchange for 99-year leases on 8 bases in the Caribbean and in the North Atlantic. And then, of course, as you pointed out, conscription or national service or selective service, again, applauding Roosevelt on that score. And then finally, as the leader, titular head of the Republican Party, Lend-Lease, which he is instrumental in making happen finally. Those 1935, 1936, 1937, 1939 Neutrality Acts really precluded the game plan that Roosevelt had of any kind of readiness should the Third Reich prevail. And it was Willkie, never getting the votes from his party, always a minuscule number of them, but who propagandized the business of internationalism and of readiness in such a way that the public had the impression, really, that the party he led was pretty much not counting the votes, the party that his views reflected. And so it was he who prodded Roosevelt into finally moving with a proposal to end the Neutrality Act altogether. He did that by garnering the support of some 3 Republican senators, Ralph Austin of Vermont and Styles Bridges, who will later be, of course, a McCarthyite, but at that point, a different sort of man, and Chan Gurney of New Mexico. And those 3 senators and 100 distinguished Republicans elected and otherwise, stating that it was time to end the Neutrality Act, backed a resolution and a motion which the Democrats, the Senate Democrats, adopted, and that ended neutrality, and that changed the options as France fell and as Britain held out against the Wehrmacht and the.
I mean, it was the beginning of a so you had these guys like Henry Luce and these establishment figures who I know you don't agree with Halberstam that they totally manipulated the nomination because, as you rightly point out, Wilkie had enormous popular support. I mean, there were 75,000 people in Elwood, Indiana, which is a lot of people in that part. I'm from that part of the country. So he obviously was a kind of a rock star. But it's also interesting to me that these conservative critics of the New Deal, Republicans, but they agreed with Roosevelt on internationalism, and that became sort of, the foundation of the bipartisan foreign policy, broadly bipartisan foreign policy that we've had maybe until now, belief in the alliance and, opposition to America Firsters and things that until Trump, Democrats and Republicans agreed on. And
Well, I'd like to give you a little bit of that business of bipartisanship. Waiting for the beginning this evening, I thought that as we are reflecting on the centenary of the war to end all wars, yesterday Wendell Willkie spoke in defeat. It was November 11th. Roosevelt has won. But he spoke over the three networks, and the reception to his speech was a tsunami. In fact, never before had the response been so
this
enthusiastic.
is November 11th, 1940, right?
This
after
is
he's lost.
November 11, 1940. This is yesterday, and yesterday, in 1940, he gave this speech. He said, "It is our constitutional duty to debate the policies of this or any other administration, but let me raise a single warning. Ours is a very powerful opposition. On November 5th, we were a minority by only a few million votes. Let us not, therefore, fall into the partisan error of opposing things just for the sake of opposition. Ours must not be an opposition against, it must be an opposition for. An opposition for a strong America, a productive America, for only the productive can be strong, and only the strong can be free." Now, that strikes us, I think, in two ways. One, quite reasonable, and indeed, because of Wendell Willkie's introduction of the loyal opposition concept so formidably, it was, for a time, the coin of the realm. Of course, it is now today something as alien, as foreign, as indeed impossible bipartisanship should be. So that was a great contribution he made. And it meant that although he changed his coat and became a Republican, what was important to him was, above partisanship, was service to a higher national and indeed international goal. And what was that? His lamentation was, and he is so eloquent about this in so many cases, that the ball dropped in 1919, the turning away from the New Deal, from the League of Nations and Woodrow Wilson's dream was a great mistake, and we must never do that again. The next war is not a war to win, he would say. It's a war when won and must clearly be conceived in goals that are universalist, that are humane, that are collaborative, and indeed, of course, he was saying exactly what FDR had scratched out at Placentia Bay in August of 1941 with Churchill, which gave, of course, the Atlantic Charter and the whole business of what would be the purpose of the war. And so both Roosevelt and Wendell, both as heirs of Woodrow Wilson, had so much that resulted in a collaboration that served the purpose of a well-defined aftermath after the war.
One of the things that I find so fascinating about this part of the book, and that I just never thought of before, is I had always assumed during the war, everybody was acting bipartisan because there was a war on. You know, you'd always hear that from our parents. There's a war on, like put politics aside. But in World War I, there had been fierce politics, and in wars we've had since, there have been fierce domestic politics. And it really feels like Wilkie is one of the reasons why we were such a united country during World War II. And people like Colonel McCormick were isolated on the, you know, the Breitbart right, you know, and nobody was paying, but without the, even though he was as big as Fox News in the Midwest, he was really isolated in the Republican Party, and it just never occurred to me before that it was really Wilkie's post-election leadership, since he was the titular head of the party, that isolated the isolationists.
Well, yes, but in fact, what one has to remember is that isolationism or nationalism was in fact the coin of the Republican realm. And what had happened was, and Halberstam is quite right, I think, to say that the role of the Luces and the role of the Chase Bank and the role of Thomas Lamon and of the Eastern establishment did not reflect the party's wishes, its DNA at all. And so for the duration of the conflict, once Pearl Harbor solves the problem that Roosevelt has, and Wilkie, even the Icarus of the air, Lindbergh, becomes a patriot for a time, but the position of the party was still bone deep nationalist, non-interventionist, with some other ists that one might throw in. So that what Wilkie is doing really is a kind of specter who represents really an unreality when it comes to his own party, but who begins to verbalize the ambitions of most Americans, and especially because of what he's about to do after Pearl Harbor. I said that his politics proved captivating because they served his ideals more than in reverse. It was an amalgam no other Republican contemporary, neat little Dewey, rigid Taft, pompous Vandenberg, precocious Stassen, or reactionary Bricker possessed. It was during those post-Pearl Harbor months that someone called him the Wall Street Abraham Lincoln, an indication of his rising stature as an American original, a natural Democrat in lower case. But to really succeed in the paradigm that Wilkie and indeed Roosevelt is pushing required a massive education and re-education of his own people. And it is that point when, after this remarkable world circumnavigation in a B-24 and debating the virtues of capitalism with Joseph Stalin in the Kremlin.
We're going to get to One World in 1 second.
All right.
Okay? So I want to have a romantic interlude here. So who was Arita Van Doren?
So I think about 1937, there was a cocktail party on the East Side, and it was given by Dorothy Thompson and Sinclair Lewis, the diadem couple of the era, and there was Arita, and there was Wendell. They met. There was electricity, and he he was flattered by her attention. She was, of course, as I'm sure most of us remember, was the literary editor of the Herald Tribune and of its book page, which really rivaled and probably was a bit smarter than the New York Times book review, Sunday book review. She had been Carl Van Doren's wife. They divorced in 1937. For a boy from Elwood, Indiana, who spoke with a gravelly voice and had a kind of unkemptness that was both attractive but at the same time rather unusual, the Will Rogerish demeanor and all that sort of thing. His meeting her introduced him to sophistication, to the Algonquin Club cadre, dinner parties in the silk stocking area of the city, and the opportunity to indeed review books. And indeed he did. Wendell wrote 2 luminous book reviews for.
Well, did he write them, or did a reader write them? There's a lot to suggest that she was his ghostwriter, that he was a rather pedestrian writer and then became pretty famous because she was a brilliant writer who got his articles out there all over the place.
I think at the end of the day that is true, but I think there's some evolution involved here, if you'll concede that to Wendell. He begins as something of a hayseed who runs a corporation and then becomes much more suave, you might say, and begins to think, I think, more in a more cosmopolitan vein. That at least is the view of the intimates of them both. Joe Barnes, a good international reporter for the Herald Tribune, or William Shirer, whose famous book explained, of course, what was going on in Germany, that it was a kind of complementarity which enormously benefited him. And she did have an agenda because her paycheck came from the Herald Tribune and from Ogden Mills, and their point of view, which was internationalist and alert, keenly so, to the dangers posed by the Third Reich's march across so much of Europe.
Just to be a little more personal, I mean, they had this very open affair. His wife, Edith, he's living with her on Fifth Avenue, but he holds a press conference at Rita's house in the middle of the 1940 campaign. Even FDR talks about her on the taping system that he, long before Nixon, had installed in the White House. It was an open secret, right?
It was an open secret, and it's interesting that, of course, in the election, it's a good thing you mentioned that, when they were campaigning, Eleanor Roosevelt was terribly concerned that FDR had said that he was really too busy to meet Willkie on the hustings, that there was not going to be any Lincoln-Douglas controversy here. He was running the country. But as the polls began to give Willkie more and more traction, indeed, as we came to the last 3 weeks of that campaign, Willkie had eliminated Roosevelt's lead. And it was at that point that Eleanor Roosevelt, and of course Ickes and some others, said, "You've got to get out on the hustings yourself." And so he did. But until that time, captured in that White House taping device, one of the first ever, Roosevelt is saying, "Well, you know, it's pretty interesting about that gal that Willkie keeps. She's kind of smart, I know." And then he goes on to say something about Mrs. Willkie, and perhaps she has got to go on the hustings with her husband, and I hope she's enjoying it, something like that. But the point was, though, that as Ickes pointed out, we can't use it, you know. We can't use it because the vice president is a loony. Henry Wallace is communing with mystics. and everybody knows that. So that canceled things out. However, it bespeaks to something else, and that was that in that era of where, how shall I put it, where hypocrisy was honored by the press, that sort of caper was never emphasized or really much revealed in print. She had, however, another agenda, and I was about to say, and that is that it is she who helped compose some of those wonderful and powerful and punchy arguments on behalf of smart capitalism in Fortune magazine and in the Saturday Review and in various speeches he gave. She was very much responsible, I think you would say, for a mind whose thought could follow the curve of his increasing literacy. She was the other muse of Wendell, the other being Davenport, who was Henry Luce's consigliere and the man who made Fortune magazine what it was. And the two of them had a great part in guiding Wendell's evolving thought.
So I'm going to ask you one more question before we open it up, and that's about the One World tour in 1943, which led to this monster bestseller that he wrote. I didn't know before your book that he flew in a B-24 all around the world. My father flew bombing missions in a B-24, and I've been in one of them, and it is not comfortable. I mean, that is a...
No, this one was a special one.
It was? Okay.
Yes, it was nicely outfitted.
But still, it's, you know, it was... But what really amazed me was what he writes, and you quote this at length, that at that time most people didn't fly, right? And they take the train across the country from LA to New York, vice versa. And he points out in the book that the flight time to Asia is about the same as the 3-day trip across the country by train. And so he used that as a way of expressing to the American people that we're as close to Asia as we are to the other coast of our own country with this new kind of transportation, and sort of introduced the world to this idea that it's a small planet. So just explain the magnitude of this book as a new way of thinking about the world right in the middle of World War II.
In many ways, it was Mark Twain updated, was it not? And that is it's a very time-bound book, of course. If you pick it up today, we know everything, and that there's no marvel. But at the time, to have this book, which outsold any book of the 20th century for a time, it beckoned Americans to think about the complexity of the world, but also its compassable similarity. And it beckoned them to think about what the consequences of the inevitable victory of the Allies would mean for them. And so American exceptionalism had a new dimension. It was not people coming down gangplanks and believing that the future's ahead and history doesn't count. No, we are about to march into a history that we're going to make, he said. And the innocence of the past and the isolationism of his own party would run up against the fact that we were going to invent the world. And if we did not appreciate the sensibilities and the needs of these who festered under the weight of empire in India and in Africa and in Asia, if we didn't do that, of course, the whole thing would blow up in a way that would simply bring us back to a third world war. It was so necessary that we embrace our obligations. It was also extraordinary because by that time he had formed this partnership with this remarkable African-American civil libertarian, Walter White, head of the NAACP. And there he became even more, though he saw enough of the consequences of empire and racism as he circumnavigated the globe, but he also found that the world was aware of the hypocrisy of democracy in the United States domestically. And so by combining those two things, the racism abroad and the racism in the United States, he made an argument for a kind of civil libertarianism which was quite new in sound. It's interesting that finally, as he looked back at his model in so many ways, Woodrow Wilson, it finally came to him that Woodrow Wilson's vision was deeply flawed by a kind of bone-deep Negrophobia, and that he incorporated that awareness in a remarkable document that says everything for diversity and immigrants and what have you. And it was the Case for Minorities, which was in 1942 a document that was quite powerful. He invoked his German heritage to say that this country is the consequence of the streams of its people who have come to serve and whose contributions are so profound, and that to allow the dividers among us would cause the fabric to tear, and we would never ever knit it back again.
That is truly amazing in today's context. Let's open it up for people's questions. Yes.
Thank you very much. I wanted you to drill down a little bit on your last point, please. You were talking about his affinity for immigrants, but could you move that over a little bit to refugees? Because we, at least in retrospect, liberals see Roosevelt, a bit tarnished when it came to refugees, specifically Jewish refugees, and I wondered if Willkie weighed in on that issue.
Yes, I would. He did, and the fact that he received, of course, it's no longer a medal extant, but he received the National Hebrew Medal in 1941. Actually, I'm sorry, it's 1942, one or two, and that was given to reflect the appreciation of the Jewish community of Willkie's position on the issue of anti-Semitism. He had done something quite special. Again, it takes us back to Lindbergh and Gerald Nye and the Senate Minority Committee, which was investigating Hollywood because Hollywood, with the Jewish moguls at play, was making films that were propitiating Americans to fight against the Nazis and getting us into a war we had no business getting into, as Lindbergh, of course, explained so cogently and so charismatically for the America First Committee. Willkie became the counsel for the film industry. And he demolished that Senate hearing after about 2 weeks, even though Joseph Kennedy, having abandoned his ambassadorship to the Court of St. James's, had made a trip to Hollywood to convene the moguls to tell them that they'd better mind their manners. They were making people angry, Lindbergh in particular. Wow. That was a great service of his. And then came, of course, in the middle of the persecution and Kristallnacht and all that, Saturday Evening Post published a remarkable article by a non-religious Jew on blaming the Jews of Germany for their own misery. And the Saturday Evening Post board reached out to Wendell Willkie to save them, and he wrote the case for minorities, which was a remarkable one, in which he said we cannot, given our principles, given our needs, given the war, be divided by these things. And so the images were of one Slavic face, one Asian face, and one dark face. That sounds all, seems all very hawkish today, but it was quite a powerful Saturday Evening Post entry. The business of what was on the book, One World, appeared the same week as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And it is quite clear in that book when Wendell talks about Palestine and his time there, a very brief time when occupying the consuls, the American consuls' home with 2 staircases, and Muslims came up one staircase and Jews the other, and argued their cases. And Wendell wrote about the remarkable accomplishments that he had seen in Palestine, even though the entry into Palestine, of course, had been reduced by the British mandate quite savagely. His view of the possibilities of development there, perhaps antedating, of course, the future, were very, very positive. The business well, yes. Mm-hmm. So,
Yes, back there in the yellow.
Hi. Did Willkie ever weigh in on the issue of Japanese-American exclusion?
he did. But I must say that he didn't do it as vigorously as he should have. In a dinner honoring Justice Brandeis, he said that he had no truck with emergency relocations of people based on prejudice. And that was clearly, he was not a Norman Thomas, who was unequivocal in denouncing FDR for the Japanese relocation. It's a bit troubling that he couldn't have found a firmer voice on that, perhaps. However, at that very moment, he was about to do something else, and one doesn't perhaps excuse the other, and that was that the very day of Pearl Harbor, a man came to his office who was being deported by the Justice Department because his citizenship had allegedly been procured dishonestly. That man was, his name for a moment, even though I devote a chapter to it.
Is this Schneiderman?
This is Schneiderman,
Yeah,
thank you very
economist,
much.
Yeah.
And Wendell took on that man's case against the advice of every Republican, in his circle, the Coleses, and indeed Henry Luce, this is a waste of our time. No, and when he returned from his circumnavigation of the globe, he argued the case of Schneiderman before the Supreme Court and prevailed. And so it is law today. And if the present regime were to wish to expel people, it would have to, on the basis of citizenship that they should not have, it would presumably find that it would be blocked by the Schneiderman
It was
case.
such an incredible story. I mean, when you imagine a Republican candidate for president arguing a case on behalf of a communist before the U.S. Supreme Court in the middle of World War II and winning.
Of course, the dynamic is interesting because Stalingrad is now perhaps about to fall, and it may well be that the Solicitor General may have had discussions with FDR about the wisdom of decertifying the citizenship of a man who had run for the governorship of California as a communist and sending him back to Russia just as the Wehrmacht is engaged. And we are yet to find our second front to relieve the Russians. And so perhaps, as Sumner Wells suggested, it might be a good idea to be very careful about the decision we made. But indeed, and Justice Frankfurter, of course, was much in the dissent on the issue of Mr.
So I think Ambassador Van Heuvel had the next question. Here it comes.
Willkie was not successful in sustaining his leadership in the Republican Party. And he was repudiated by the leaders of the Republican Party after the election of 1940 and lost the primary in Wisconsin in 1944 and removed himself from the presidential contest. But Franklin Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie, I think, had great respect and esteem for each other. And that one of the things that was calculated as a possibility in American politics was that a new liberal progressive party could emerge from the fact of Roosevelt-Willkie leadership. And your own research of this, do you find it plausible that Willkie gave any thought to that possibility?
I'm glad you asked that, because that was my last question.
It is. I think it's the chapter 1944, not this time. Yes, that's an extraordinary moment. We know, in fact, that it is not a hypothetical, that in fact Roosevelt sent Harold Ickes to propose that Willkie accept the vice presidency in 1944 with the ousting of Henry Wallace. And at the Ambassador Hotel, where Ickes and the Coles brothers and Wendell discussed this issue, the Coleses were really quite concerned that Willkie found this interesting. And he told Ickes to report to FDR that this was something to think about. Indeed, it failed of its own iniquity, that proposition. However, Roosevelt wasn't finished. And so about 4 days later, he sent Sam Rosenman, his speechwriter, and this time to the St. Moritz Hotel. And there, Rosenman informed Willkie that Roosevelt wanted to find a third party that took the best of both parties, get rid of the Republicrats and the Democrats and get rid of the isolationists in the Republican Party. A third party, he said. And Willkie said, well, this is interesting. And we think about it. And the correspondence is rather interesting. Roosevelt, in a kind of offhanded, grand seigneur way, says, Wendell, I have to go away, but when I come back, we have to talk about this because it's really important for us. And Wendell writes a letter in which he says, this is a great idea, and I'm all for it. But he never mailed the letter. He didn't mail the letter because, of course, Franklin made sure that the proposal was leaked. And so what he did was he both prevented Wilkie from going off on his own tangent with the ILGWU and the Dubinskys and others into a kind of third-party issue. That bothered him, and so he compromised Wilkie in that way. But on the other hand, at the convention, it's a bit overdrawn by Drew Pearson, but the floor was full of people who were ready to have a Wilkie for vice president, as poor Henry Wallace, of course, almost saved himself because, of course, FDR had said, if you can prevent them from getting rid of you, I'm all for you. And Wallace quite succeeded. He's almost brought the House to his support, but as you perhaps remember, the recess changed the fate of Wallace for Harry Truman. But even so, when they resumed, Senator Wagner reached for the podium to call out for a Wilkie demonstration. That did not happen. They tried to reach Franklin. They got Miss Tully, who said that he was not available, and of course, Harry Truman became the vice president. But that, though as politics, it was really a fantasy. You can hardly imagine the Democrat bosses of Hague, of New Jersey, and Chicago abiding anything like that. Their hatred of Wallace, though, was bone deep, and they just might have scratched their heads a bit. But in any case, it's a hypothetical. But I think what it is significant is that both men are going to die. Roosevelt knows that he is, and he's not going to fulfill his dream of presiding over the peace. MacArthur came into the White House and gave him 6 months to live, and Rosenman says everybody who came in and saw Franklin knew that he was a goner, perhaps except for Franklin. But Wilkie, of course, is hale and hearty. And with Churchill, discussions and what have you, it was quite clear that Wilkie's role was to be both at the United Nations and as proconsul of a conquered Germany, the man who would execute so much of the Atlantic Charter ideas that both men took fairly seriously. The problem is, of course, that Wilkie dies before FDR. When Rosenman's revelation of these negotiations or machinations were addressed to Eleanor Roosevelt back in the late 50s, she said that she was quite quizzical that Franklin never mentioned the possibility of these things happening. But she said, you know, Franklin always had a kind of premonition of what needed to be doing, and perhaps indeed there was in some way a vision on his part of a Wilkie who in 1948 would be a major player in the firmament of politics.
Blanche Cook gets the last question. It's coming.
First of all, David, thank you. This is the book we really need now.
Well,
All of us. But I have a question. My favorite part of the book is, of course, the one world part, his epiphany. Everything that happens anywhere affects everybody, everywhere. We are one world. And here we are celebrating the war to end all wars, the peace to end all peace. What would Wendell Willkie, and I think you have to write an op-ed. What is Wendell Willkie going to say as he marches with Angela Merkel and Macron against the beasties? There were 84 heads of state at the peace forum, and it's Wendell Willkie that will take us into the future, thanks to you in this great book. What would you say?
Well, I'd say thank you very much for for the endorsement of the usefulness of the book. That is, though, I think, really the question, isn't it? And it's that the blue wave, of course, almost fizzled. It's a good thing that the House will be in the hands of the Democrats. What on earth they will make of it is, of course, the question. And there's little reason to think that there's anybody, visionary indeed, who can mobilize and have a narrative that can be politically implemented. I think maybe the benefit of Donald Trump may conceivably be that this is, in fact, a situation so awful that if Dante were asked for his opinion, he would have to create other circles. We cannot.
That's a great line. Great line.
We cannot believe that we are here, but we are. And we're not going to get out of it with the Democrats right away. And so this is a way of going through purgatory and coming out. And we have to emerge. Otherwise, of course, it is Weimar. And there are many of us who think this is a Weimar moment. Yes, but I think the benefit will be that a decade from now, things will have righted themselves somewhat through catastrophe. I think that's it. To see, it would be lovely if Macron had staying power, but he really will not. And Angela Merkel is saying goodbye. And the Brexit thing is going not to end happily. And there we have Bolsonaro, who is going to give away the Amazon to agribusiness and ensure that California fires become regular everywhere. And so it is really a very grim and Armageddon kind of future we have. Wendell might have said something like, by not doing the things that he hoped would happen, we shouldn't be surprised.
So I'm going to just take moderator's prerogative and end on a slightly more hopeful note, which is that the world should definitely read David's book, but it's very interesting. Now, this is not going to happen in the Republican Party, but it's very interesting, as I mentioned, that nobody in the United States really knew who this utilities lawyer was. And 3% in the Gallup poll shortly before he was nominated. So people do emerge. This country, we've produced Trump, but we've produced some pretty great people too. And sometimes they can emerge like Franklin Roosevelt did when we really needed him in 1932. And so, as Jesse Jackson said, keep hope alive, because there could be people who emerged, and some of them did emerge in this last campaign, which I'm much more positive than you are. The blue wave did not fizzle. It just early in the evening, it seemed like it was fizzling. If you actually look at the returns, they're very, very significant. They're the biggest gains for Democrats in midterm elections in, I think, 70 years. Anyway, on that note, thank you so much, and everybody read the book.